Okay, here we go, round two. In this chapter, we're going to refresh our memory on life after the American Revolution. We're now a nation, and in order to be identified or defined as a nation, there are certain parameters that have to be established. Um, some system of governance is absolutely necessary, and so that's what this entire chapter is about. The documents that will ultimately define this country. Um, as you can see from the title of the slide, that will be the Articles of Confederation and ultimately the U.S. Constitution. So in this chapter, we're going to be discussing the parameters of both documents and ultimately why we shifted from one to the other. And in the grand scheme of things, we would like to figure out um, what documents satisfied various liberties and freedoms, what document satisfied various principles of security and safety, and ultimately, which document, when it's all said and done, um, created a compromise of sorts so that this nation could flourish and ultimately other nations would uh, see as a standard to move forward in their development of their country and their people. So we start off with this chapter, chapter 7, the Confederation and the U.S. Constitution. Um, at the outset of it all, America was more of a name than a nation. We had a name for ourselves. We were trying to identify ourselves. We have to remind everyone that in this new world, after that revolution, we were proclaiming ourselves to be a republic. In every other continent, in every other nation, we had kings and queens in control. And what we were wanting and willing to tell the world is that it was okay and possible to give power to the people, to everyday, ordinary individuals, because they had the capacity to let you know what was real and what was of value. Now, this isn't an ideal in the sense of this chapter, or at the very least for this slide. I consider America more of an ideal because America is presenting itself as a nation that values independence, liberty, justice for all, that all men are created equal, and these are ideals to strive towards. We never actually obtain these ideals. We establish them because these are goals that we would like to achieve. And remember, an ideal is something that transcends reality to some degree, but that does not mean that it's not obtainable or achievable. For example, an ideal grade in this class would be 100. Um, is that possible? Sure, it is. Is it a reality? Not for many, but we're working towards that, and we can probably make it happen. So we're trying to show the world that it's possible to give power to the people. At this stage, I would like for you guys to underline the Continental Congress. Now, we have underlined this before, but we did it in the context of the American Revolution. Remember that this is a secret meeting of delegates from various colonies. Ultimately, the first Continental Congress had only 12 colonies in attendance, and the idea was to unify ourselves, identify ourselves as Americans. We were now united. In the context of this chapter, at the conclusion of the Continental Congress, all the delegates were asked to report back to their respective states and begin drafting new state constitutions. A constitution is a document that, in essence, governs an organization or an entity. And they made it very clear that these new constitutions must give sovereignty back to the people, must give, and we look at the word sovereignty, the key word in here is reign, which means rule. And what we're getting at here is that the authority and rule of the people must reside with the people. So that's the idea. As we're developing a new nation, we're very dedicated to the idea that the people should have power as much as possible, especially at the state level. So the what you need to understand about the Continental Congress and why it's important in this context is that we are now developing state constitutions and we're giving power back to the people. This is a novel idea, and considering the reality of the time. Now, what exactly does the Constitution do? It defines the powers of government. We need to make sure that the authority is derived from the people. Most state constitutions will have a Bill of Rights, and a Bill of Rights are liberties that are extended to the people, and they are practically inalienable. Um, they should transcend, and as you can see here, they transcend legislative whims, which means that despite the come and go of legislative times, there should never be an infringement upon your rights as a human being, as a citizen of the United States. When we ultimately develop a national Bill of Rights, we can see that those rights would include items such as freedom of speech, freedom of press, right to bear arms, the no quartering of troops, and so forth and so forth and so forth. And the idea behind this, again, the Bill of Rights, if at the state level, gives a great deal of power to the individual, so that these larger government entities, which will develop in time, will not overwhelm you. At the state level, there are executive branches and there will be judicial branches. However, they have a fairly weak jurisdiction, and they do this with purpose. Remember, they just got out of a bad relationship where there was this overwhelming sense of tyrannical rule. They're trying to step away from that. So they would rather have a legislative branch that has sweeping powers, because of the three branches in state government: the executive branch, legislative branch, and judicial branch. The legislative branch is the most representative of the people, and that's the one that we want to give focus to. Now, before we declared independence in 1776, a Second Continental Congress will convene, and I want you guys to underline that here. And in the Second Continental Congress, we decide that maybe a national constitution should be devised with respect to the state constitutions. So each state constitution was acting in their own entity, but there is this notion of unity, there is this notion of collectivity, and in that sense, we need to have a document that represents us as a collective. And the document that they ultimately drafted is called the Articles of Confederation. You definitely need to underline the Articles of Confederation. Adopted in 1777, but not ratified until 1781 because the parameters that required ratification. Also, let us not forget, we're in the midst of an American Revolution, and we're not really sure if we're going to make it out in the end. So it's kind of audacious, but it's thoughtful planning on the part of these founding fathers or these revolutionaries to develop some form of governance, a document that would identify it as such, so that way we could move forward with some type of plan. The Articles of Confederation is America's first constitution, as you guys can see here. And that needs to be absolutely understood. And I know right here it says that it's with the capital C. You could make an argument that it should be lowercase c, but the Articles of Confederation is America's first constitution. And so let's jump into the parameters of what exactly that means. First and foremost, there is no executive branch. So there's no executive branch. There's no branch that enforces law at the national level, because that's the whole purpose of an executive branch. There's no president. There's no judicial branch, which means, and when we look at our current times, the executive branch is signified, or we can look to the president as the leader of the executive branch. When you look at the judicial branch at the federal level, at the national level, we could look to the U.S. Supreme Court. But again, they don't exist at this time. We give all jurisdiction, we give all power back to the states. The state will have a judicial branch. The state will have the executive branch. I mean, by and large, let the state navigate and operate as they should, because they're the ones that have their ear to the ground and understand the needs of their particular entity, their particular people. When it comes to national issues, each state will have one vote, and they design that because that will create a greater sense of equality. Hey, look, every state has one vote. That's fair. Boom, let's move forward. In order to pass a law, 9 states must approve. That makes it incredibly difficult to pass laws at the national level. And for many of the states who are currently in the midst of a revolutionary war, they're fine with that. The idea that we shouldn't make any drastic changes at the national level. If any changes are to be made, we can make them at the state level, and that's the most important level of change. Any amendments to the Articles of Confederation, and from here on out, I'll be referring to it as the AOC. Um, any amendments to the AOC will require a unanimous vote from all states. That makes it almost, I don't want to say impossible, but damn near impossible to change the Articles of Confederation. The idea of getting every state on board for something means that it has to be of extreme importance. I mean, we could talk about the difficulty of passing laws when you look at situations today, um, especially with this so-called bill to assist the American people in the midst of this crisis. They find difficulty in finding unanimity in that. Um, Go ask 5 people, if they're in a car, ask 5 people in a car what they want to eat, and you're probably going to get 10 answers. So that would be difficult to change the Articles of Confederation, but um, that's the way it's set up. And one thing I definitely want you guys to tie in about the Articles of Confederation is that this document is a very heavy-handed state rights document. It gives a great deal of power to the states. Now, what exactly could the Articles of Confederation do? What exactly could our federal government do at the national level? Well, it says that it can declare war, it can make peace, they can sign treaties, they can borrow money, and they can create money and standard of weight to validate that money. The bottom line is that it appears that the national government should only exist when there is an existential threat to all the states involved. Outside of that, there really is no power or authority to give to the federal government. As far as they were concerned, the states, that is they were going to operate as their own independent country, and until there was a threat that affected all of them, there would be no national need for unity. When you look at why we're called the United States of America, the word state in of itself on the world scale implies that it is a nation. We've discussed this before, like when you would refer to something as ISIS, which is the Islamic State, implying that they believe themselves as a unique entity, and a collection of peoples worthy of nationality, of nationhood. Now, what can the federal government not do? Absolutely, the federal government cannot raise money. Now, the way that the government raises money is by way of taxation. So, under the Articles of Confederation, it is absolutely illegal for the federal government to tax the American people. Can the American people still be taxed? Sure, but at the state level, in the state you reside, and it would be for state purposes. The federal government cannot enforce laws because they have no branch or authority to enforce laws. They have no official court, so they can't make judgment on those laws. Again, when you look at it, when it's all said and done, a great deal of power is given back to whom? The state. The state has all the power under the Articles of Confederation. And that's kind of how they wanted it. Understandably so, considering the situation they were involved in regarding the rule of Great Britain over the colonies before the American Revolution. Then we run into some issues. At this time, I want you guys to be aware of an individual by the name of Captain Daniel Shays. But for the sake of the slide, you should probably go ahead and write out Shays Rebellion and underline that. Make sure you put a star by it. The reality of the situation is that you have these former revolutionary veterans who are returning back to their homes, and they're finding out that everything that they fought for, greater sense of freedom, greater sense of economic freedom, the reduction of taxation by a tyrannical government, an individual like Shay returns home only to find that he is now under the thumb of a new form of economic taxation at the state level, and it's excessive. And he feels like he can address it by simply communicating with the bankers of the area. He simply just asks. He goes up to a bank and simply asks them, "Hey, can you guys relax on these issues of excess taxation? Can you?" And where he was asking not for um, them to absolve him of his debts. He understood his debts. He was just simply saying, "Guys, can you give me some time? I just got back from fighting so that we could all be free. If you could just give me some leniency on these debts, I'd be happy to pay them off. I understand that they are mine. So if we could just suspend um, the notion of taking my property, that would be great because we are all trying to find our way through this crisis." When you look at today's situation, how dare um, some governments not consider the leniency towards mortgage payments, um, electrical payments, water payments, and considering we're in the 21st century, technological payments. Let's say, for by example, an internet bill. How can we not, at the very least, put a suspension on those bills? Not to say that they're not due, but yo, can we chill for a second so that people can figure out a way through this situation, navigating that we are practically repurposing all of our economy to ensure the safety and security of people during this crisis. You know, the idea that you would have some principalities or governments by way of, you know, a city or a state or the nation at large not consider those options while people really are struggling, man. We're very fortunate. I should say I'm fortunate that I have an opportunity to continue my occupation remotely, but there are a lot of people that don't have that opportunity. And really, just people need relief. Like, just give people some time. They're not asking for a handout, they're asking for some help. And in a nation that's as abundant as we are, the idea that we can't provide that, and the idea that somebody like Daniel Shays was fighting so that we could all be free to pursue life, liberty, and happiness, it seems like it's not possible. So what does Daniel Shay do? He organizes other revolutionary veterans, and they say to themselves, "We got to get back out here. We got to start fighting again because it seems like we've replaced one tyrannical ruler for another, and it happens to be ourselves." So he goes on a rebellion, and this will be known as Shay's Rebellion. He's burning down banks alongside many of his colleagues. And when it's all said and done, the rebellion will be squashed. But the reality was is that when they would travel from area to area, from state to state, nobody had a solution on how to take care of it. There was no executive action that could respond to this situation. And it just demonstrated how weak and how um, um, fragile our so-called country was. I mean, we call ourselves a confederation. We're the United States, but we're governed by an article of confederation, which means that we're loosely jointed. When we look at the situation today with the coronavirus, we are exposing the fragility of many state governments. Many states are struggling to do this and to do that. And they're looking to the federal government for leadership and assistance. One can make an argument, well, no, each state needs to take care of their own, and that's fair. However, if each state is to take care of their own, then why do we have a national government at all? The national government should respond to issues that are affecting many states, if not all states. And if we're blind to look at the situation of the virus and not realize we need a national response, the issues like Shays Rebellion is fairly similar. And what I mean by that is that they were affecting various states, but there was no way to provide an adequate response that would be within favor, or I should say, the greater good of the country. Yes, it was ultimately settled by private militia and other entities coming together to stop Shays Rebellion. But what it demonstrated is that there was this insatiable appetite for liberty. Many Americans wanted more freedoms, and man, excessive freedom can be scary for some. And all it did was it demonstrated that in reality, Shays Rebellion proved, and I'm going to type it right here for you. Shays Rebellion proved that the AOC was not strong enough. It wasn't adequate enough. It was too weak. It was too weak at the national level. So we're going to need some changes. That results in something called the Constitutional Convention. Now, at first, it's not called as such. An individual by the name of Alexander Hamilton, who's this guy right here, he is a businessman, and he recognizes a lot of problems with the Articles of Confederation in regards to conducting business. Each state was acting as its own nation, and that made it very difficult to trade. It made it very difficult to conduct business. Each state had their own currency. It was ridiculous. Like, I would try to sell a good in, let's say, Delaware, but I'm from Maryland. And as I'm selling the good, they required me to use their money. And then there was a transfer rate. And then the transfer rate was never equitable to the money that I had in hand, or at the very least at the value which I thought it to be. You know, it was almost as if we were another nation traveling and trading amongst nations. You know, when you take the U.S. dollar and you go from Texas to Oklahoma, it shouldn't change that much. Now, granted, when you take the U.S. dollar and you go to Mexico, it's going to change because that's a separate nation. That's practically the reality under the Articles of Confederation. Each state was operating as its own independent nation, and it just was not good for business. So Alexander Hamilton says, we got to address this, and I'm going to hold a meeting, and I'm going to call it the Annapolis Convention. Not a lot of people show up to this convention. 5 people showed up at this convention, and he realized, whoa, this is not what I was expecting. That we got to have a greater draw, and you know, optics and are everything. So by framing it as an economic convention, as a business convention, can attract many people to this situation. Reframing it later on is what Alexander Hamilton will decide upon, and he informs everybody that we want to meet again, but this time around, we're not simply going to focus on business. We're going to focus on the entire Articles of Confederation and cover, you know, from one end of the spectrum to the other, the problems that we all know exist. And when he framed the conversation in that capacity, when he framed the narrative in that capacity, the optics of the discussion changed, the optics of the convention changed, the optics of the concern changed, and more people were willing to invest their time to that issue. So the Constitutional Convention will be held May 25th, 1787. We go from 5 individuals to 55 individuals. 12 states are in attendance, and they convene in Philadelphia to discuss the Articles of Confederation. We had individuals like George Washington in attendance. He'll ultimately be the chairman of the convention. Benjamin Franklin is there as this wise grandfather Yoda figure. I mean, he's there as legitimacy of the revolution. James Madison is in attendance, ultimately identified as the father of the Constitution because he's the primary author of the Constitution. So that needs to be understood. Um, and Alexander Hamilton, of course, is there because he's the one orchestrating it all, directing or establishing the foundation for us to have this conversation. So Alexander Hamilton is a key founding father, advocating for a stronger central government that the Articles of Confederation simply could not establish. What were the goals of these patriots in Philadelphia? What were the motives of this meeting? Again, to control commerce, establish a sense of continuity in commerce. We wanted to control tariffs. Tariffs, if you're not aware, is a tax on imported goods. And if you can control tariffs, that could be positive in the sense that we can promote American production. Or lower tariffs so that we can increase international trade. And then last but not least, we want to control the mob to ensure that we have no more breakout rebellions like Shays' Rebellion moving forward. Now, when they got into discussing the Articles of Confederation, there were issues here, there were issues there, and then everybody in attendance ultimately came to this conclusion that I don't know if the Articles of Confederation is a document that can be saved. Like, we might have to completely get rid of this document. And that's exactly what they did. They said, we're good. We can just, let's trash it. Let's destroy and rebuild. We're going to start over completely. And we're going to start from scratch. We need a, and now what's odd about this is that they had explicit instructions from Congress to simply revise the document. They came to a conclusion that this document is not worth saving. We got to start from scratch. One could make an argument that that sounds kind of illegal. That wasn't their charge, but they went in that route anyways. They closed the windows, they shut the doors, they put troops outside the building, and they said nobody's to come in, nobody's to leave until we get this kind of situated. One of the first issues that they wanted to address was this issue of representation. You know, under the Articles of Confederation, each state got one vote. That bothered larger states because they're arguing like, yo, we got a population of 1,000,000 people. How do we get one vote? A population of 100 people, they get one vote. That doesn't sound like equality. That sounds like representation by acreage. That don't make any sense at all. So we have this presentation of something called the Virginia Plan. The Virginia Plan would argue that representation should be based upon population. Of course, smaller states are going to be like, no, you can't discriminate against us because we're small. We need to have representation on acreage based on statehood. You know, it's not our fault we have a small state. You know, you could give up land and then our state could be bigger. And then we could, then if you want to do it based on population, let's make it happen. But, you know, we can't do it when these states have been pre-designed as such, and we're just operating in that capacity. Man, this isn't fair. And so they're arguing back and forth. And one argument from the Virginia plan is like, hey, yo, accept this or we're going to leave. New Jersey says, well, you accept ours or we're going to leave. And you have those type of attitudes, then nothing gets done. So a compromise has to be established, and the compromise will be known as the Great Compromise of the U.S. Constitution. The Great Compromise of the U.S. Constitution. You guys have to know this. Ultimately, a compromise is struck. Somebody comes into the fray and says, hey, why don't we have both? Why can't we have representation based on population and statehood? And we ultimately create what is known as a bicameral legislature. Bi meaning two, cameral meaning house or chamber. And there are two chambers to our Congress. One will be known as the House of Representatives, which will embody the Virginia Plan, and the other one will be the U.S. Senate, which will embody the New Jersey Plan. Now, we have a new legitimized legislative branch. It's bicameral. And when it comes to this issue of taxation, because now taxation is going to be a reality at the federal level, but in order to make sure that it's representative of the people, every tax bill must originate in the House of Representatives because it's that chamber of our Congress that is the most representative of the people. Now, on top of creating a new redesigned legislative branch, they decide to create a new executive branch known as or provided by um, a leader in that branch, and that leader will be known as the president. So now we have at the federal level an executive branch, a legislative branch, and we will also have a judicial branch. The executive branch is led by the president, the judicial branch will be led by the Supreme Court, and the legislative branch will be led by our US Congress. Now, in regards to representation, here comes another issue. You know, if we're having representation based on statehood, regardless of size, each state gets an equal amount of representatives. That would be the Senate. But man, when we get to the representation based on population, that's an issue because some states have a lot of people. But wait a minute, some states have a lot of slaves. Should slaves be counted in the population? According to the South, they wanted their slaves to be counted in the population. And they felt that it's only fair that these slaves should be counted in the population. From the northern perspective, the argument is that no, you can't count your slaves. You don't treat them as people. Why in the heck are you trying to count them as people? Because they knew that if they counted slaves, that the South would have an enormous amount of power to wield in regards to legislative action. So the South is arguing, well, you count our slaves or we're leaving. The North is saying, well, you know, you count them as people or we're not counting them at all. And a compromise is struck because in the grand scheme of things, if you look at any compromise, what you can always take away from it is the following, that without these compromises, we wouldn't have our U.S. Constitution. So a compromise is struck. It's known as the 3/5 compromise. You gotta know this. You gotta underline it. You gotta be aware that of what this actually means. Does it mean that slaves are counted 3/5 of a person? Absolutely not. First off, nobody can be 3/5 of anything. Secondly, they're not citizens. They do not have the right to vote. They do not have the right to exercise themselves as citizens. They don't have a say in anything. The idea of counting them, the idea of the 3/5 compromise is simply to count slaves for for proportioning delegates in the House of Representatives, and that's it. So the idea of every 5 slaves that you have, 3 of them will be counted towards the population. They don't have any rights. They don't get the right to vote. They're not considered free. They're not anything. So this notion that, well, I was 3/5 of a person, that's also not only true. You were 0% of a person. You weren't considered human beings. This was simply a political parlay, if you will, in order to satisfy both sides so that we could move forward. In reality, the South will get 60% of their slave population counted towards their total representative count. Now, what does the North get out of this? The North argued that in 1807, we need to have a discussion about the slave trade, and they will have that discussion. 20 years later, they have a discussion in 1807, and when it's all said and done, the international slave trade in America will end. In 1807, the United States will cease to trade slaves legally internationally. It's not allowed. Now, does that mean that Carolina can't trade with Virginia slaves? No, of course they can't because that's not international. Now, I'll tell you this. If you know that in 1807, we're no longer trading slaves internationally, guess what many states are probably going to do between 1787 and 1807? They're going to start importing slaves in great numbers because they're worried about the idea that they won't be able to do it later on. It's just like all these fools out here hoarding toilet paper and eggs and all these other items because heaven forbid they go without. Meanwhile, there are plenty of people who decided not to hoard because they didn't want to be that guy, if you will. Um, and now they're sitting at the house trying to figure out, well, how do I get this and how do I get that? I was trying not to take advantage of a situation, and unfortunately, we live in an environment where that because other individuals are taking advantage of a situation, that forces us to take advantage of a situation. That because other people are hoarding materials, we now have to hoard materials. And it's hard to be faithful in a room full of hoes. That's the reality of the situation. People are acting out of pocket, and so now we have to act accordingly. When you have a lot of people with the understanding slaves are no longer to be traded internationally in 1807, you got a lot of southern states picking up in that capacity. Now, we're giving a great deal of power to the federal government, but this scares some people because remember, we were afraid of creating a constitution that did this, which is why we ended up with the Articles of Confederation, because we were worried about our government being tyrannical and dictating everyday aspects of our life. So there were safeguards for conservatism. And what do we mean by that is that economically, there would be sound money and the protection of private property. There would be a uniform currency, and the IHA's rebellion would be limited because private property and ownership is a value, and especially in the South, because a great deal of their private property was in the ownership of human beings by way of slavery. Politically, we're going to be fairly conservative because, yes, we have three branches of government, but we have this amazing intricate system of checks and balances. And that's so important here. Checks and balances are massively important to the framework of our government. And what it should compel and dictate to many of us is that no one branch is greater than the other. We have to give as much weight to the presidency as we give to the Supreme Court, as we give to the legislative branch, or Congress for that matter. In the legislative branch, we have the House, they're elected every 2 years, the Senate, they're elected every 6 years, the Supreme Court, they're on there for life, and in the presidency, they serve every 4 years. Each branch has a system of checks and balances. You guys can check that out later. But, not one branch can ever do too much unless you have another branch that co-signs on that authority. So when we worry about, oh my gosh, this person's president of the United States, they can't do that much unless Congress co-signs, unless the Supreme Court co-signs. And if those two other branches decide to co-sign on some problematic policy or your, we should be all cool in the game. However, people can be weak, and we find that there could be a failure of leadership or courage to stand up against a branch when we find them acting out of pocket. But the beauty of our government for quite some time is that despite the popularity of a president, we can see that a president can be checked. In my 1302 class, this is very clear and evident when we get to the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. When we look at our current situation, whether you're dealing with the presidency of George W. Bush or Barack Obama or Donald Trump, we hope that if and when these presidents act out of pocket, we have the other two branches of government to put them in their place, and vice versa. Let's say Congress is acting out of pocket. Let's say the Supreme Court is acting out of pocket. The other two branches are in place to safeguard the American people. Then we run into something that's called the Electoral College. You got to know what the Electoral College is. I ranted and raved about this issue in lecture, if you guys were there. You got to know that the Electoral College is the entity that ultimately selects the U.S. President of the United States. The American people do not select the president. There is something that is called the popular vote, and then there is something called the electoral vote. The popular vote is what the people want. The electoral vote is what ultimately happens. And very seldom do these two votes not align. However, within the past 16 years, and we're in the 20th year, and so an election cycle is coming up. And within 16 years, at the very least, from the year 2000 to 2016, there have been 2 times in 16 years that the Electoral College has not lined up with the popular vote. And that has brought attention to the entity of the Electoral College as to why it exists, who's in the Electoral College, what do they actually do. Yo, you can go and Google members of the Electoral College. Why are these people not in our everyday ether? Why are they not in our everyday conversation? We discuss congressmen all the time. We discuss senators and representatives all the time. We discuss people on the Supreme Court all the time. We discuss people at the executive level all the time. Nobody brings up the Electoral College. Very seldom do we talk to individuals in the Electoral College and the power that they wield. How did they get there? Who determines how long they stay there? It's this shadowy entity, but they exist because do you really trust your neighbor to pick the president? Have you had conversations with people out there? The idea behind the Electoral College is that our founding fathers did not trust the American people. One could make an argument that, well, rightfully so, you shouldn't trust the American people. Others would make the argument, no, right or wrong, the power should be with the people at all times. We're going to make mistakes, and that's fine. But I'd much rather the people make mistakes than representative of people make mistakes, at least on this issue. But, you know, there are arguments for and against. You guys can take it as such. But in the framework of our U.S. Constitution, the Electoral College was established by our founding fathers because they simply did not trust the American people with the ability to select the U.S. president moving forward. There have been conversations about dismantling the Electoral College, but that's for later conversations and discussions. But bottom line is that it was established. The purpose of the Electoral College is to pick the president, and it was established because as a safeguard against mobocracy, a safeguard against democracy at large. Don't you ever think that democracy is reflective of the United States government. You can't find the word democracy in the Declaration of Independence. You can't find the word democracy in our U.S. Constitution because we were not designed to be as such. We are a republic, which means that representatives of our choosing ultimately make decisions for the greater good of our society. We're running into individuals. We finally have the document drafted. The document will be called the Constitution, and supporters of this document are known as Federalists. Federalists are individuals that favored the Constitution, supported a stronger central government. They tended to be wealthier, more educated, more organized, and they controlled the press. And when you can control the press, you control information. When you can control information, you control what people know. And if people don't challenge or question what they're being fed, they'll accept a lot of what's put in front of them. The Federalists were feeding the American people that the U.S. Constitution was the best way moving forward. It would protect everybody, and not unbeknownst to them, it seemed like this would be the best path forward, and they got it established. When you look up here, you can see Federalists, or at the very least, there's a picture up here of individuals here, here, and here. These Federalists are the most infamous Federalists. The first one being Hamilton, of course. The next one being James Madison. And then this last one over here is going to be a guy by the name of John Jay. John Jay will ultimately be the Supreme Court Chief Justice, of the United States. Madison, the father of the U.S. Constitution. Hamilton, the organizer of the Constitutional Convention. Because of individuals like these and through their efforts, through their utilization of propaganda and media, they're able to convince much of America that the U.S. Constitution is the best foot moving forward. So when it's all said and done, we have a document known as the U.S. Constitution. And you've got to underline this. You've got to know the U.S. Constitution. What you need to understand about it at large is that the Constitution is the document that ultimately governs these United States. It gives a great deal of power back to the federal government. And the beauty of this document is that despite the fact that it gives power to our federal government, it creates this very unique balance with our state government. So that way we can enjoy a yin and yang relationship moving forward. When we look at the title of the slide, it says restrained freedom. We have to understand that it was a militant minority of radicals who won our independence, but we wouldn't want these radicals to ultimately govern our society. Players don't make the best coaches. Coaches don't make the best players. You can go look at our current situation regarding the NFL, and you can look at Bill Belichick as the greatest coach of the era. I don't know if this guy was ever a great player, but he is a great coach. Some of your great players will never end up to be great coaches. I would never want somebody like Dez Bryant or I don't know, Randy Moss to be the coach of a team. They may be great players. That doesn't mean that they're great coaches. So with that being said, a militant minority of conservatives who are on the opposite spectrum of radicals, who are willing to fight and die to secure freedom. You needed these conservatives that were able to channel and harness that energy and contain it so it didn't get out of control, so that this country could move together in harmony. We need that type of balance in the country, and the Constitution is a document that embodies both the radical and the conservative. The Constitution is a document that both embodies the liberal and the conservative. And that's the enduring paradox of American history by way of the US Constitution. I would never want to live in a society of nothing but conservatives. I would definitely never want to live in a society of nothing but liberals. I moving forward, the idea that we can live in a society where both sides are respected, both sides have a voice, both sides have champions, and ultimately what will save this country is a compromise between both sides. Today we look at the word compromise as a dirty word, but in reality, if there ever was a word that was definitive of our genius, if there ever was a word that was definitive of our ability to survive in our infancy, that word is compromise. And that's how we have to finish this lecture.